Hello, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to the Out of the Woods Threat Hunting podcast. This is the live edition, Discord interactive version. It really aims to cover some of the burning topics that all threat hunters and security stuff that we want to talk about. But as a reminder, because this is live, we also have the Discord server running. We will take comments, questions, hoping to try to make this engaging, and maybe we can talk about something that might bring up some sort of burning question yourself that we can discuss further collectively. So now to kick this off, we usually kick it off with some interesting artifacts. But a quick introduction: I'm Scott Poley. I'm a senior threat hunter at Intel 471. I'll kind of go around the horn, and then we'll jump into the artifacts.
I'm Tom Costura. I'm a threat hunt analyst here at Intel 471.
And I'm Lee Argonal. I'm a senior threat hunting analyst as well.
So Lee, I think you got the first artifact that you wanted to drop and talk about. If you want to take that away.
Yep. So my artifact is called cybersources.site. I'm always a big proponent for, continuing education, sharing what we know. With all of you in the community. Hence, that's why we're here. But this was just a resource that I came across that I found was pretty cool because you can poke around a lot, you can find all these different things on your own. There's GitHubs out there, but this is just something that came across real quick, and I thought it was neat because, of course, anything tagging is great because it drives your focus, right? It's just easy to understand. You don't even need to know what you're coming for. You can look. I mean, looking at pen testing stuff, and it automatically filters out like what you need to know. But going through these, it's really cool. And I didn't do a deep dive, but going through and just looking at the tools, thinking about how I've used them in the past, things I haven't used in the past. And I guess I just really appreciate the collection that they put through here. I think they say they're a central hub for a wide range of tools, resources, education materials, especially what I really like is the learning and training resources. Granted, there are some here that you have to pay for, like Hack the Box, Try Hack Me, and so on. But the others that may be free and like just the resources here are pretty neat because that's one of the biggest things that or biggest hurdles that we've heard from the community is that I want to become a threat hunter. I want to become a pen tester. I want to get into cybersecurity, but they don't have the resources available to them because they can't buy an EDR. They can't buy a Splunk license and so on, or they don't have the data or whatever. So any chance that I have to champion an organization or someone that created that community or that resource, I'm definitely gonna. So I hope you can go check it out and let me know if you like it or not.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things isn't just so much the tagging, but they also have like the categories and subcategory sections. Because a lot of times, like even as a threat hunter, it's not necessarily the attack part or the threat intel that I might be struggling with. It might be the thing that they're using and why is that so significant? What does that typically normally do? Like, why am I seeing this? And like just being able to say, oh yeah, in Windows, there's some operating system based functionality, and that's what they're taking advantage of, or there's some, um, specific utility that is being utilized in a certain way. So yeah, I think it's always great to be able to have some quick way to get at this. I haven't dug into like pivoting from this to actual the resources it points to, so I can't really speak to that necessarily. But that's always a just having something centralized is always. I mean, you can see almost every security practitioner that has anything publicly posted. They always seem to have a page on here's my favorite tools or sites. So it's obviously an important thing that a lot of people kind of chase and follow.
And real quick before you talk, Tom, I'm gonna jump it. I saw this and I meant to mention it yesterday, but I'm wondering if we could get our own little page here. I mean, because we've created I feel like a good amount of resources along the way, from the cyborg time, and still moving forward today. Um,
Yeah,
I'll definitely after this, I'll definitely join Discord and see what we can do with them.
yeah, a lot of our training stuff and everything I think could be available here. That'd be cool. We got Tom. Any comments?
Yeah, I love these types of sites where they kind of put like a collective together of different tools and resources and things for folks. One of the interesting ones that I dove into on here in the handful of minutes that I've spent on it was in particular under the OSINT category. And there was quite a few things in there that it's all net new to me. There were some interesting tools that do scraping on social media stuff. Um, there was a bunch in there. I started clicking through some of those. Again, it's only spent a little bit of time in it so far, but definitely some ones I want to check out. So yeah, this is pretty cool. Thanks for sharing this, Lou.
The real thanks goes to cybersources.site.
Boom.
Yeah.
All right, who's next?
Yeah, I'll go next. I'll paste it up in there for you, Lee, so it's there. And um, so mine is kind of stemming from what we're gonna be kind of diving into in general for the main topic. Kind of like, how do we develop ourselves as threat hunters? How do we get started? What were some of the challenges? What was the journey like? How do we get better over time? And this kind of stands out. Like all the guys that know me know that like I fell in love with Bloodhound the second I discovered it. Uh, but if you're not familiar with Bloodhound in general, it's a great, they call it an offensive tool, but basically they say like 6 degrees from domain admin saying that, basically will uh, recon an environment, mostly just looking at Active Directory, if anything, and can build basically the attack path for who you would have to compromise, what machines you'd have to pivot through in order to get to domain admin, and all the variable paths that it can discover based on possibly poor configuration and least privilege. But what's also interesting about it is it does also reach out to machines or computer objects to determine where are live sessions. So you can kind of get a snapshot in time of where do people actually sit or where their credentials being used or logged into. Uh, but it's usually a point in time. So I share that because there's also Falcon Hound, and it's not supposed to necessarily replace Bloodhound. It's supposed to kind of be adjacent to it. So what's cool about Falcon Hound is they do uh, suggest that you should use the Azure Hound and the Bloodhound there. Do your maybe one day or once a week or once a month kind of crawl to get like this is what the environment looks like. And then Falcon Hound will look at other telemetry to say how the sessions changed over time. And now what's cool about this is its results, it can write to other tools, right? So it can write to Splunk, it can write to Sentinel, it can write to a various number of tools, the outputs of those. So then you can query those based on other analytics you want to develop in your environment. And this I think is big because even just from an incident response perspective, because it's looking at a live snapshot of where people were active or not, you can actually leverage these two things together to say, oh my gosh, where's we think this account is compromised. Where do we need to look next? You can look at a snapshot in time about where were those credentials used and what was adjacent, and is there a logical attack path and all those types of things right there. And what's cool is I think the actions they call it that you can kind of program in there that can run to basically create alerts or other things too on top of the data. You can have it either using graph specific things, so it can run things in Neo and visibly show you those things. It can run and give you results in other formats with other solutions. So it was a really cool, I would say, upgrade to something that really got me dug into how do things look and behave in my environment, and what are my risk or possible attack paths to pay attention to. That was just like next level. So kind of brought it up here because I mean it just made sense to me. So I don't know, what were your guys' take when you guys saw this?
So my first question, and I know I've watched you play with Bloodhound before and blow my mind. Um, but can you use this real time? I know you kept saying snapshot, but can this be like actively running real time, or does it take time to process the snapshot, put into the data, and view?
So from the documentation I was looking at, they were saying that Falcon Hound is something that would like cycle every 15 minutes. And I think it you could call it real time because I think what it's doing is looking at all the login events, unlock screen events, all those type of activities that show interaction in your environment, and doing like a 15-minute search back to say, okay, what's relevant, and then it will go in and change those relationships in the Bloodhound data, right? So, for instance, if there was a session, it might change the session from has session, meaning someone's currently logged in, but that person on this box, to had session, meaning They were previously on this box, so they've used it before, but they're not currently active. So it does things like that as far as updating the data, but based on different telemetry that's more real time.
Now, could you whitelist an account inside, or I guess can you whitelist an account? Because the one
I
thing like
Yeah, I think you could uh configure the query that runs that pulls that data back to then do the update. Because I mean it's all GitHub, so it's all exposed and it's nothing convoluted in there. They're pretty good with documenting like, hey, this is a YAML, this is how you configure, this is where you drop things, this is what's actually running. So if you're familiar with your tool sets, I think you can kind of customize a lot of that too.
okay, because I was just thinking about like the group or the team that has to create the images and everything, and maybe they're using the same service account to log into every machine that's ever been created to stand up. Like that would be like really noisy. But I guess if there's a time frame, um,
Yeah, I mean, it'd probably deduplicate that too. It'd be like it's present everywhere. But that'd be also be good to know, right? From a tax service perspective, like this account gets hit, it's everywhere, right? So
I'll stop.
be on Tom.
No, this is really cool. I think the some of the stuff I kind of am interested in the knowing more is like where it tracks some of the other things, like kind of compiles them together, like the exploitable resources or like the exposure level or your exposure layout. The other part too that I thought was cool was the session tracking. And kind of how like it introduced a like an active and previously active sessions, and you can kind of like select which one you want to focus on, and it kind of gives you that bit of an ability.
All right.
But yeah, it was also like the real time thing. It basically, if I was reading this right, it's set up on kind of like a cron job type thing where you can kind of set how you want to run it based on how you want to leverage the resources and things like that. But yeah, super cool. It's something I really want to play around with in the lab.
Yeah, I think that the biggest challenge is if you want to play with it, like how do you deploy it initially, right? Because it's not like
Hmm.
since it's kind of an open source type thing, you have to have like maybe some resource like tangent in your network, and people may have to sign off on all sorts of things depending on how you run it. Because it will store a lot of really, I wouldn't say sensitive, but important data, right, about your environment that
Hmm.
you don't want out anywhere. So there's a lot of that that goes on. But as far as a great open source tool that's free, as long as you have the time to play, I think it's great.
I
Absolutely.
just need to find some dummy data for it.
Yeah, that's the other thing. So I'm glad you brought that up. If you go to the Bloodhound link that I put in there for Bloodhound, they actually have two links to create a dummy domain. So it either will generate a random domain environment or there's a predefined as demo domain. So you can use Bloodhound to explore the significance of it and practice running queries and seeing kind of outputs from that. So even if you don't want to run it, say, in your environment, or that's a challenge there, to understand the value of it, you can still play with kind of dummy data that they'll help provide. This is cool.
Absolutely.
All right, Tom, what do you got for
All right,
us?
I guess I'm up. Item I have, um, I will drop it in the chat if I can figure out how to computer. Um, this is just a resource that I had come across for, it's a webinar that talks about threat hunting in Azure, specifically. I found it interesting. This was dropped, I think last December, if I remember right. And I found it interesting. It's a short little session, little recorded session, about a half hour or so plus some Q&A. But basically, one of the kind of high level overviews of it is it gives a bit of that kind of separate detail as far as like when you're hunting in the cloud side versus on-prem that I thought were interesting, even from a high level. It
Right.
also goes into some of the speaker Poonam Kodag. She talks about how the different details are, but why they're so specific on the Azure side and like ways that you can leverage the tool sets that are there. Leveraging the unified audit logs in Azure, the different platforms and the interfaces in the web tool in the cloud tooling that you need to access to do the hunting specifically to that. This is of course outside of like Sentinel or Defender, but this is just a short resource that I thought I'd share with everyone. I'm excited about diving and getting more advanced inside of the cloud hunting sides, Azure, AWS, etc. So I just thought it was something interesting to share, especially when we're talking about, where we are in the in our current landscape as far as threat hunting is concerned, and people that are looking to break into this area, which I know we're going to go into a little bit more about becoming a threat hunter. I just thought it was an interesting nugget to pass along to the community that if anyone hasn't seen it, it's worth checking out.
Yeah, the big thing about the cloud I find very interesting is, you mentioned this one like covers Azure, and every cloud environment from people I've talked to is kind of managed differently or designed differently. So the same approaches don't aren't like a one for one across environments. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges to kind of get people up to speed on, like, just do X and you can threat hunt or secure certain things in the cloud because X is different depending on what environment you're in. And like people know like the big three, but there's even other cloud environments out there that aren't even like the Amazon, Google, and Microsoft. So that problem can get very challenging, especially if you're looking for a specific cloud security person and it's not the cloud they've worked in before. But I also, when I answer this question too, when it comes to cloud-based security, I also feel like some of the focuses though can be similar when you distill down the concepts from like what are the primitive actions that usually happen when someone lands in an environment. Like we know when someone lands internally, the people are going to have to figure out how to execute whatever payloads are malicious, maybe figure out some persistence. I feel like that's a little different when someone gains access to a cloud environment because persistence is just, do they have active credentials to an account that can access it? So then it's more about how do they evaluate what those credentials can do or that account can do? How do they elevate to something else? So it's almost like a different take in those vertical stacks that a lot of times will happen as the precursors to an attack in the cloud. So I feel like even though the environments may be different, if you understand the data and what lends itself to those types of verticals, then I think that's kind of how we have to start becoming successful in those spaces, or a better understanding of them, at least.
So I have zero experience with cloud hunting so far. I haven't got there yet. I'm sure I will once I get forced to, once I'm thrown into it. Um, but so I'm just gonna completely bypass this artifact. No, I'm just kidding. What I'm more concerned about, um, and this is a whoever's live out there right now, because like Polly and Tom said, this is a big thing, right? Everyone's, especially because of COVID, everyone went to the cloud. Everything was unsecure, uh, insecure, not unsecure, insecure. Um, my
Just
question
like in
is
your answer. No, I'm just kidding.
exactly. Is anyone doing this right now? Like, and if you have some tips and tricks that you found in your own environment, could you share them with us? And also, and I guess Tom and Pulley, this is more towards you. Do you see uh, cloud hunting more of a unstructured versus structured? Like, well, I understand there are still the same hypotheses, but you mentioned the uniqueness of each customer or each environment, right? Like, I mean, I understand you can apply the same hypothesis to it, but because of the different uniqueness, do you feel that unstructured hunts would be more successful in the cloud just by looking at the data and understanding your environment and knowing what goes on versus saying I'm looking for credential dumps and so on?
Yeah, I feel like so if you look at like internal assets, one of the security principles is like least privilege, least access, right? But if you have an internal asset, you can get away with not doing a lot of that because you can be like, well, we've surrounded it by so many things that even if we don't do a good job with privilege and access, very few things can touch it. The cloud, I feel like, is slightly different in that regard. So I feel like configuration management is what will enable you to do more things with security. So there's a bigger onus on that because obviously, if there's more least privilege and things are just created for a specific single purpose, then it's really easy to see when they violate that, right? Versus you have some common, kind of like account that can do many things, and then when it does something it shouldn't do in one of those many things, it's not going to look very different. So it's a lot harder to understand that. There are some like key things in certain cloud environments that looking at what threat actors have done in the past may stand out. But those things I think stand out much louder based on how you configure those assets and things too. So it's kind of give and take there.
Yeah, and a generalized answer from my side, I say unstructured. And I say that for a reason. I think that's absolutely going to be both. And I think where we can apply structured hunting is going to be really good to help people spin up. But I think personally, and just on the experience I've had, the cloud is still the Wild West, and the rapid pace, like to what Scott had said about, the access, the privileges, all of those things, they seem to change faster than a lot of people are ready to necessarily implement, which opens up a lot of kind of continuously growing avenues, in my opinion. So I feel like it's unstructured, but I'm also biased. I love unstructured hunts personally, especially like because it feels like
You
you're
like
exploring
discovering
something that
things.
yeah,
Yeah.
I like discovering the new thing, right? And it's not that and that is no shaded structured hunts. They are absolutely wonderful. It's just fun to be able to have that ability to dive into something that no one knows and maybe find the thing, find the nugget first, or go get the Easter egg or whatever. Maybe it's a gamer mentality. I don't know. It's just, but I do think the cloud is still going to sit more towards the unstructured side, at least for a little while.
Hmm.
So us professionals get very good at structuring it for everyone, right?
Yeah. So to kind of change the direction to kind of get to the topic here, right? So, like I mentioned briefly earlier, uh, we really wanted to talk about in this episode specifically about, what made a significant difference in our lives as a threat hunter, either starting out, encouraging us to grow, and then what are some of the hurdles and things you come across. So we kind of have a series of questions we'll walk through, but I also think this is a great topic, especially for the people that are here listening and hopefully participating on Discord. Some of your own experiences may align with some of ours, or they may be uniquely different, but I really think it's a good piece for a lot of us to discuss on together, because I think this is what I think helps a lot of people out in general. Especially, I have conversations on this topic just in passing as I meet people, and I always learn a lot just from talking to people on this. So I guess, Lee, you're going to kick it off with kind of our first question and breaking in on how to break that ground as a threat hunter.
All right. So, first question we have up on the list is how did you get introduced to threat hunting? Very simple. And if you're here, if you're viewing us live, feel free to throw your experiences in the chat as well. Because we're three talking heads. We know how we got here. We would love to hear from everyone else how you got into threat hunting or how you are trying to get into threat hunting or cyber. We don't care. Share your experiences.
You're like the perfect infomercial.
Billy Mays here.
Yeah.
That's
So
probably really dated.
yeah, so mine, it's kind of interesting because it was by accident. To be completely honest, if I go back, I want to say it was probably around maybe before 2017, but around 2017. Um, I went to a NERC conference, so that's like the Northeastern Reliability or something like that with the power stuff. But it was a conference about the energy sector, and typical conference setting. They had some trainings available, and they also had like the talkers, right? And I went just as an analyst. And I remember I've never taken an offensive anything. Like anything offensive exposure was just stuff I read about. So sure enough, as exciting as that gets, I saw there was a class being taught that was called attack methodology. I'm like, well, that's interesting because that's a different way to talk about attacks than just pen testing. All you heard about red teaming and whatever was all pen testing, how to break in. But methodology kind of piqued my interest because I was like, well, what does that really mean when they like, why do they say it that way? But either way, I was kind of hooked on the idea. So it was one of the few classes I went to, and it was taught by Michael Morris. At the time, he was with Route 9B. They've gotten acquired by Deloitte a while ago, but they specialized in threat hunting. But I didn't know that going into it. He was just talking about attack methodology, and this guy was sharp, right? He knew his stuff, and he kind of told us his story about how when he worked in the government, one of the side jobs he kind of had was, I think, handling some sort of monitoring, and there was a specific system that was getting pwned daily, and instant response back in the day. What did we do? We just kind of burned it and rebuilt it. Right? It was that was the easy thing, right? Just reimage. And so he would create these tickets for them to deal with this stuff that he would find, and found that they didn't actually fix the root problem. Every single day after they rebuilt it, that attacker was back, probably got in the exact same way because that hole wasn't closed. And because no one wanted to listen to how this was happening and like the concerns of like, hey, you guys aren't doing the right thing. There's a key, mechanism. And he got so good at finding this attack that he saw the methodology and was like, yep, no, it's the same thing. We had to do this, put in the ticket. He just created a Python script that created a ticket every day to reimage the machine. That was his solution because he couldn't get, and I was like, so kind of a funny story, right? On how to deal with everything. And then what was interesting is then he kind of pivoted to talk about what most people talk about with attacking, and it was Metasploit. He just showed like a simple, we're going to exploit something, we're going to use Metasploit, we're going to get into an environment. And then he kind of scaled the approach, saying a lot of times when you break into an environment, you have to laterally move. And he went on to say, oh, well, look, Metasploit, you can create where you can pivot through your different payloads as you move across the environment. But it wasn't robust enough to where once you get about 2 to 3 lateral hosts in, Metasploit starts to struggle with the pivoting, right? Of the proxying that connection from the furthest host back. You get where it breaks connections, you got to move. It starts to have certain issues. And he started to describe how, but there's another method. You can just use something built into Windows. And he went on to describe how you can use NetSH to create a rule that anything that comes in on a certain port on that box, you can have it forward that to the next thing. So he created these pivot points using built-in functionality in Windows, and I was like, well, that's like mind-blowing to me because I was like, the only thing up to that point, I was thinking everyone has their custom tools. They have their like special crafted toolkits that help them to able to do this whole thing. And he was just using the box. And lol bins wasn't a topic of conversation. There wasn't sites out there that listed all these things out. He was just doing this because he understood how adversaries would behave and the limitations of attack tools based on experience. And that was the workaround. And I was thinking, God, that's crazy because there is no AV that's going to tell us at that time or EDR that NetSH was bad. So in my mind, I was like, how would we detect this? And then of course he kind of pivoted to this is how understanding how adversaries work and what they have at their disposal, you can look for these things that tools just natively won't. And so that was kind of my big introduction, right, to threat hunting. And it was like, wait a second. It just opened my mind to a whole new approach to security other than let me respond to alerts and let me, do what I need to do based on, I'm relying too much on products at that point. So yeah, that was kind of like my big aha moment. And then of course things grew from there, but that was pretty much how I was introduced into threat hunting. It wasn't actually the intention necessarily, but obviously today I see the value and I'm doing it. So what about you
Living
guys?
off the land binaries before it was cool.
Yeah, right.
Go ahead.
For me, there's kind of a crossover, and I want to save a little bit of this juice for our next kind of topic or question here. But for me, it really kind of started to be centered and really talked about. So like threat hunting for a while, and I believe it was probably similar time frame, Scott, somewhere around like that 2016, 2017 realm. It was starting to be kind of out there, right? People, this term was out there, this idea was being talked about. I remember specifically, and I can't remember which one that I attended, but it was a B-Sides conference, and there was a breakout that kind of started talking about that. But what I remember very distinctively was the kind of after session. If anyone's ever been to a conference, or for me particularly, the B-Sides tend to be a lot more like everybody's engaging with each other and the presenter because they're more smaller scale and localized. I think that's maybe why. But there was this really cool after talk where people started throwing out what they thought threat hunting was. And it was almost like you could see this mind map come together where
Yeah.
everyone's like, hey, we're doing X, Y. And there's like these little points came out. And everybody was talking about it. And it was like things stemming from a lot of different points that people were putting together that were like, hey, we're all kind of threat hunting now. Like, this is what we're doing. This is what makes sense. And you can like just in that little moment kind of felt like this became a reality for me. Like in that, it was like, hey, it was like detection engineering, it was analyst and log gathering, it was all these different pieces that would happen in like SOC or a security aspect or something like that. Vulnerability management, all these different pieces seemed to kind of find their way together, and people were like, hey, wait, and they were connecting the dots. So for me, that's when like the idea of threat hunting became legitimized. And there's more to that, but I'm going to kind of put I'm gonna put a break in that because I know I'm gonna talk about that coming up here. How about you, Lee?
So I tell this story all the time, and I always provide this reference as well. And it's funny because these two were here to see it happen. I believe, Tom, you just got back from Black Hat 2016, 2017. We're all working at the local energy company. And you you or another coworker was like, you gotta check this out. And it was the Miter Attack Matrix. I don't know how fresh it was. I don't know if it was version one or we were just catching up. Um, but I was like, okay, I'll check that out. And then somewhere along the line, before or during that time, I ran into this tool analysis results sheet from the JP or the Japan cert, and still being pretty new to what we're trying to accomplish in a SOC, understanding what is coming into our sim at the time. Because I was still trying to catch up. It was more of the logic of this alerted, this means this happened. But I was trying to catch so much up on what do we do versus where does that come from. Then I stumbled across this analysis result sheet, and it was like, here's all the log sources that we just executed, now living off land binaries, but all the Windows native tools that they use. And they just turned all the auditing on, like just to capture all the events that were created. And that led into the content or detection engineering team. I was added to it, where we were staying up detection engineering. Tom, I believe it was me, you, and another coworker that were like leading the charge. And like Tom said, it was like, hey, this is great. This is cool if we can identify something that is, we know it's bad. But in the back of my mind, like as I'm going through the minor attack framework, because I'm trying to apply that to the detection engineering that we're doing, the question that was just in the back of my mind is like, well, what if they don't do this, but they're able to accomplish the same goal differently? And that's where like all those factors into, there's too many arguments, there's too many parameters, there's things that we cannot account for. Or if we do that, it gets too noisy, it gets too resource intensive, and that detection now it does more harm than good. So the question was always like, well, how do we do this better? How do we do this differently? And then I left, and then I took a job somewhere else. And after a year, I fell into Cyborg because I looked. Actually, funny story. Our VP of sales actually reached out to me at the time on LinkedIn, and I think I blocked him. But then I like went back. I was like, wait, what is Cyborg? And I checked into it. So instead of being like, hey, I want to be a customer, I was like, I want a job. And then it all started clicking there, and everything just started making sense. I had a great leadership, or still have great leadership here, and that's just, I know that's where we're at now.
I feel like you answered, when did you start threat hunting? Would that be your answer for that, Lee?
I don't know. I think 2020 when I joined Cyborg would be the actual answer,
Okay.
because
Okay.
I think what I was the thought was there, but I don't think I was doing it effectively at the time.
I got you. Yeah.
During the 20s, during the energy times. But yeah, I think once I actually got here, it was fully like matured threat hunting.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing, because I wasn't so in tune with MITRE when I started out. Like I knew MITRE was kind of a thing. I looked at like the Lockheed Martin kill chain. I was like, oh, another way to kind of describe attacks and label things. That's like really cool. But like I didn't really understand how that could help me in a way. So just like anything else, I made threat hunting a very complicated solution, right? So it was like, well, if I'm going to do threat hunting, it's got to have this like perfect solution that's going to deal with all this data. It's going to find that needle in a haystack, and that's going to be threat hunting. I'm going to prove that it works, right? And what was interesting on that whole premise was the first two things I wanted to solve, which I thought were really cool solutions, but not scalable for everybody to use. And you kind of it's like a purpose built solution that you couldn't just use your built in technologies to like put some basic stuff in there. One was, we dealt with the Russia trying to break into different things. One of their big attacks to the energy sector in general was they used watering hole like techniques, right? where they would take over sites and compromise them of like specific blogs that pertain to like electrical engineering and things like that to try to somehow pivot or gain credentials based on what they were doing with some of the SMB capturing by planting things in there. Um, that was the technique. And in my mind, I was like, gosh, these are how will we capture that? Because obviously tools are going to miss it, especially if something's net new. We had the advantage of if we had people going somewhere via the proxy, web proxy, if something was not categorized, that was kind of like one way, right? To say, well, if something's so new, it's not known, we could try to block things that way. But the other thing, like I said, boiling the ocean, we did do a course with some of the Route 9B stuff, and they did kind of show how you can retroactively look at like your web data, and they took the Alexa top million, which they basically would say, oh, these are normal, right? So look at everything outside of that. And I was like, that's really, really cool. Except for in a watering hole instance, how do you know that one of those really, really normal sites didn't get popped and now is, an avenue? Um, well, based on doing something very similar, I did the whole, well, let's try to assign Alexa ranking to every single web proxy data, and what would that look like over time? And then how will we refresh all that and then compare those values? And ultimately, I think the solution worked, but the amount of technical implementation for it at scale didn't, or people couldn't buy into it to support that, because if it broke, it would break. It'd be really hard to fix, essentially. Um, but the one thing I learned, and I think Lee, yours is one of the traffic that we actually used in the test case, was when people actually browse the internet, they have like an average Alexa ranking as far as do they usually stay on very popular sites or not, and you can see the deviations, and those deviations were significant to say they went somewhere weird, like what took them there, right? And so it was like purely like a data driven analytical approach to threat hunting that was kind of cool. But like the effectiveness to say, if that's all I developed for the first quarter of a year, people will be like, the threat hunting program isn't working well enough, because the returns just aren't there. And then something similar to that, when I started on in tangent to that, I got turned on to DNS tunneling. And everyone that was like, I don't know why that became a hot topic, but people were like, oh, what do we do? Like that can get around a lot of our secure areas because people DNS is available and they can just go right out DNS. And then after like doing the right appropriate research or something like that, just be able to say, well, if something's making like 1,000 DNS requests within a certain period of time, or, like a high number, that's suspicious in general. And that kind of turned me on to the behavior approach. Like something's behaving outside the norm than typical protocols even call for, or typical people would do. And that's what kind of turned me on to that. Threat hunting might be more than just creating a really cool analytic. There might be a behavior component that we can key off of to make it more productive, I guess. So that's how to answer that.
But the key cool analytics are pretty sweet too.
Oh, my understanding of how things just like people are and the internet was designed, like all those things I learned in the process, I think are golden. But I think a lot of corporations don't care about what you learned. Like
No, no.
they want the value.
They're not proving ROI based on your knowledge
Yeah,
enhancement.
I'm so much smarter now. Like
Yeah.
we did it.
I mean, for me, like when I talked about like that eureka moment when I was at that B-Sides conference, like circling back, it had made me realize that I was threat hunting from the get, from my perspective and how I kind of started. So, like, small, quick, dirty background. My intro into security, I was dropped in as an analyst into a SOC that was being stood up. It was like from the ground up, and everyone was trying to figure out what to do. And in a pretty quick time, we had a SIM solution that was in place. It was kind of, the primary pane of glass. Definitely using air quotes for that. And there was all this data being plugged into it, and we really didn't know what to do with it. And I, for some reason, I don't know if it's because, I just like hurting myself, or I'm just insane, or it's just, I think it's really cool. I started diving into the dog data just to figure things out. So somehow the stars aligned, and we didn't just operate in that situation with out of the box detections. We learned the analysts, especially at the beginning, we learned pretty quickly that those things had such a high false positive rate, and being able to figure out why they were firing. There was a lot of stuff there. So that forced us into this place where and the allowance into this place where we're allowed to dig through the data and figure things out, come up with new ideas for different types of things. So as we start learning about threats, we didn't look to see if there was an out of the box kind of rule set that went in there. We looked to build something that would help us. So in that, we were doing the dive before developing a rule set for SOC or for other analysts to handle. We would be going in and looking at our environment to see, does this exist? We were limited in scope. The depth we could go back at that time was limited, but the data was large, and there was so much possibility that I like. And that, fast forwarding, I realized like that's a big kind of seed of what threat hunting is. You're going to go in and you're going to look at these logs. Like this is more where I guess I align with that whole unstructured thing, because you're going to go in, you're going to try to figure out how to find this thing or detect this behavior or identify this anomaly in your environment. And so I didn't realize it at that point, but I had started threat hunting right there, like right at the beginning when I was diving into that and having to figure that stuff out. So being dropped in front of a large log data set from many different types of sources, and coming up with solutions to find bad. So it was like that, so for me, my entry into threat hunting was very much attached to the detection engineering side, because there are a lot of parallels that do tend to happen there, right? And then it just kind of grew over time, but yeah.
No, I like so I am
So I guess
cyber. I'm sorry, I was just say I am
oh, I'm sorry.
cyber.
Go ahead. No, no, no.
They put in the chat that like the way, yeah, absolutely, like the journey you've already started as far as how you looked at things, how you learned things, how you kind of pushed yourself and kind of did the whole critical thinking, building relationship behaviors over time. I think that's a great, like, already I think the journey's off to the right start. And you can clearly see the passion and what it is you're doing to learn all that. For what we suggest, how to progress. I'm hoping we'll touch on that towards the end of this. So I guess when we start talking about that, if we don't hit something specific, try to ask that question for some like a more pointed way, for maybe something we missed if we're not answering it completely. But I do like the journey. I think your journey is spot on as far as I think how a lot of people that do well in this area approach it.
Yeah, the tie back to Scooby Doo is wonderful. I
Yeah,
love
yeah, it's
that
great.
very much. Like that's so spot on for this field for sure.
What? Because it's always someone that you've met already that's wearing the mask, or someone you know.
A lot of
It's
times,
Lee.
yeah, it's Lee, yeah.
That is true. That's why they call me APT Lee.
Yep.
All right,
Oh,
so jumping into kind of the next step here. So, it's, did anything change as you guys started your threat hunting journey, like your perspective, understanding, anything like that?
so 100%. From what I thought threat hunting was to where I am now, not only the technology has changed, um, not only, but I think the biggest thing was my understanding of how a computer works, like the normal processes, um, living off land binaries becoming a thing, the different tools like EDR. I believe whenever we started that EDRs were just becoming a thing, and that's why Sysmon was so powerful to me, because it was that logging or that visibility that became EDR. Um, that understanding was huge. And then I think from a perspective of what else changed is just how I approach the problem. It's no
Yeah.
longer a static problem. It is a constant moving target, something that you have to be aware about. When I think my biggest aha moment was whenever I linked the threat hunting process to like the scientific method that we learned back in the day.
Yeah.
Whenever that, like, when I saw that similarity, I was like, wow, like, I'm actually applying this, which I thought I never would be, because, I didn't know where my future was going to be. I didn't think I was going to be a scientist. Um, but thinking about, hey, I read this. Let me think about how I'm using Intel to now drive my threat hunting. Because back in the day, it was all like shooting in the dark, right? Looking at the MITRE ATT&CK, looking at your environment, unstructured hunts. How do we apply our environment to our hunting? versus now I have direction. Now I have focus. And that focus is just kind of like refined throughout the years. So I think really how I approached the problem was the biggest change. And the tools make it a lot easier too.
Yeah, I mean, I think the big thing, it's kind of similar, is I just started looking at security differently. Like, you know, I remember starting out and not really knowing how to handle threats, how to understand attackers, all those types of things. Um, I, was hyper focused on finding the right indicators because they're the easiest thing to search on. And it was almost like if I got a hit on an indicator, then I went to try to understand, well, what happened, why, right? Versus now I'm very more context focused, and I don't really care so much about the indicators because of those chains. I want to understand what was going on that was even being leveraged, that infrastructure or leveraged whatever that was. Um, so I really started to understand how someone did something more. And it became a lot more interesting over time. And then I started to, as I approached information that way, I started to kind of understand and see patterns emerging, right? It's interesting, especially if you try to profile an actor and you take various different sources of reports that report on them historically to present, and you'll see that sometimes there's just this common thread that always seems to persist on a majority, maybe not all of the incident reports or whatever that kind of report they are, but you'll see that common thread. And those types of patterns are like really key, I think, in helping to understand the problem. And then also, if you start understanding what it is that they're doing and how they're doing things, that understanding makes you understand your environments and your technology you're dealing with, the attack surface better. So overall, just kind of changing how I looked at things by having that like different view on security just made me a better security professional, I think. And maybe I had to solve problems differently.
Yeah, from my side, it was I think the biggest leap, and again, I had kind of like a reverse approach to the thread hunting because I was like doing it, and then I had a eureka moment, and then it was like, okay, now take what I've been doing to that point, attach it to
Mhm.
this thing I now understand. One of the biggest things that catapulted from that point forward was the ability to ingest threat intelligence or information to operationalize it, to make it useful in a way, like especially with threat hunting. Take this thing, understand what it's trying to tell me, understand how to go look for it in my environment, and then go do the thing and find the bad, right? That was the thing that I think was one of the biggest, like, when you look at that as you increase over time, there was a really big stack there for me as far as how to really ingest the information that was given to me and how to better operationalize intelligence, like, and it tied directly into how I was hunting, how I was building detections, things like that.
Mhm.
Plus, the other thing too is like the prioritizing efforts too, I think was another big thing because I think a lot of us, and maybe hopefully I'm on point here, but maybe I'm not. But I imagine us three at least had this kind of shared similarity. There is a good portion, especially when you're just starting off, no matter how it goes, whether it's an analyst or you're trying to get into threat hunting out of the gate or something like that. It's a lot, and you don't know what to do with all the stuff being thrown at you, right? So like once you kind of like really go into that journey, those pieces start to fall together in a really cool way. I know it's like really high level, but definitely like once I realized, hey, threat hunting is X, everything started like just putting itself into its lane and like getting to the success points just started feeling more streamlined, and they started entangling with the other initiatives from the different cyber groups that I was working with at that time, and everything started to really kind of come together. So it was just like it was really cool. It's really cool to see that change happen, if that makes sense.
Mhm. So now to kind of pivot to like the bigger
So,
challenges.
jumping into yeah. So let's talk about some of the challenges of threat hunting. So, what was the initial struggle getting into threat hunting for you guys?
So it's kind of interesting because I have like two different approaches to this. Because one, um, when threat hunting was first talked about, like back when I felt like I was discovering it, like all of a sudden I started seeing threat hunting pop up everywhere. And then it got destroyed by every product saying we do threat hunting already, and then it kind of just died off because the definition of threat hunting was so muddied that what we do today and what we define today was not what was being represented across the board. So
Not
when
at
it,
all.
I had to go to leadership at the time when I was really on board with, hey, we should be doing. I mean, I was a leader myself. saying we should probably be doing threat hunting. And what was weird is everyone I would talk to would be like, well, aren't we doing that already? Right? Like they assume that's what security operations is. Well, aren't you looking for threats? And you're like, I mean, yes, but it's like such an alert driven process that looking for threats is, can we build enough detections, right? Which is a failing approach in a way. Like there's so many gaps you can run into with that. So there was that, like just the social atmosphere of like, how do you socialize threat hunting that actually describe how different it is than just what typical security operations do. Um, and then the other, you know, this was also the days where tooling wasn't really up to snuff, and data collection was difficult or more difficult. So you had, this was like ArcSight days for us, right? Like, how do you, if you want to do any analysis on any kind of query, first, it's going to take a long time to run a big query across big data sets. Second, you almost have to take those results and hopefully they're small enough to put into something like Excel to do any kind of grouping or analysis on any of that, because your results are a line by line scenario in a lot of instances. There's no aggregation happening naturally, all that kind of stuff. Very hard to do. And then Intel, there was such a hyper focus during that timeline. I think for a lot of folks, where it wasn't how many reports can you get, it's how many IOCs can you collect. I mean, if you look at just government feeds at the time, government feeds just gave you IOCs. And they started doing some sort of tagging with like, MITRE and things like that, but there was no like report that described why this is even being talked about, right? So then it was really, really, really hard to do threat hunting when your tools didn't let you deal with volumes of data and group things by data and kind of get an understanding to like ask the right questions of the data. But then you also ran into, well, the information I'm trying to ask questions on, like for me to find that context, I really would have to go outside whatever normal processes are to even find sources to start looking at that. So yeah, there was like a whole lot of challenges coming out of the gates when I was originally looking into it. I feel like a lot of those have gone away, which is really cool, especially from the technology side. There's a lot of really great technology out there now. I feel like still some of the challenges with leadership probably still exist to some people. But I think that just comes down to justification because they look at it as now a net new team versus an add-on, which people can kind of argue both ways on that too. But yeah, those were the initial, definitely the initial hurdles right out of the gate.
So I think the biggest things I hear from the community is the resources available. Wait, time out. Are we still on the biggest? What's the initial struggle getting into?
Yeah, what was your initial struggle?
Okay, understanding. And I want to get this. And I posted a chart in the in Discord.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, reading on it was not the chart I found. And during this 5 minutes, I found out that the chart, and I'm going to post the original or the false chart in here because I always reference this one because I thought it was legitimate, but it's not. But that's how I felt. Is that
yes, emotional side of it, right?
Right, like you know nothing, but you feel like you've figured everything out. And as you're going through the threat hunting or through my journey, all of a sudden you realize like, oh, there's a lot of stuff I don't know, and then you start the real climb. And really the biggest struggle getting into threat hunting for me was the actual understanding of it. And I mentioned that's what changed most, probably because I was so fresh at it, but understanding how to apply things differently and not just to look for IOCs, understanding how the adversaries work and so on. That was the biggest struggle, getting into the right mindset.
Right.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect. I've always kind of thought that applies to cybersecurity as a repeatable thing. So in some ways, like it's kind of like that's a roller coaster that we live on, and
it's like you level up and you start over again.
Oh yeah, and that's probably why imposter syndrome's become basically our sidekick in this field, right? It's just the nature of it. It's crazy.
We are constantly in this cycle right here. I know nothing. I'm great, or I'm super confident. Wait, I don't know anything, but we never get past this valley of despair.
Yeah.
Yeah, there should be a door at the end of the top right there at the sustainability part that says, like a directional flow chart, cybersecurity or other. And when the cybersecurity says, it just drops off a cliff and starts over, like every time, on so many ways, in so many things. Initial struggle for me getting into threat hunting, a lot of it had to do with, you know, getting the buy-in to chase things that weren't like I think Scott referenced it a bit. Getting the buy-in to go after things that weren't like, you know, the out of the box or kind of like the generalized solutions for stuff because at that time threat hunting wasn't a mainstay. You know, I still think it's still really in a level of infancy in general now. I mean, the field's definitely growing, but at that time it wasn't a thing. So is getting that buy-in to say, hey, we need to spend resources chasing these things or finding these things or discovering these things for a lot of different reasons, right? That was always one of the struggles that it really was a barrier to get going faster. Like hindsight looking back was that the ability to kind of like one, be able to speak to the value of it, and then two, get that buy-in from leadership to allow us to chase these things and sometimes break some things in the process, but you know, scientific method, right?
I mean, what is it? You can't make an omelet without cracking a couple eggs.
Cracking some eggs, or a few dozen sometimes.
It's a big omelet. All right. So, what are, and I guess this is going to flow straight into it, but what are some difficult things you face now that you're in it? What are the difficulties now?
So, if it's okay, Scott, I'm gonna start on this
Yeah,
one.
yeah, go for it.
Um, I'm gonna kind of go on a narrow one because this one it's been fun. Like as I've matured in threat hunting and I really understand like the methodologies better. I understand how to, you know, look into the systems, dive into the logs, look for the dots that connect, all of those things. One of the sides that's become a bit of struggle for me, and I don't know if this is like necessarily a level of maturity because I think this is part of threat hunting in my mind, at least at a certain level, is kind of emulating the attacks to drive them into your lab. So I hit my head against the wall so many times, at least at this phase in the game, of just trying to, you know, make sure that my hypothesis is correct, my structure for how I'm going about finding something is correct and replicating that data is so important to kind of get to that mature, structured hunt that I want to build. Um, and I tend to run into problems like being able to emulate that because this is something that back in the day when I was doing more detection engineering, a lot of times you would build something off of a theory and then you drop it because you felt pretty strong about it and then you drop it out in the wild and then you'd go through all these hiccups from a
Yeah.
detection engineer of an alert standpoint of like
So you
dealing
work
with
backwards.
tuning and exactly you work
Yeah.
backwards. So the idea of being able to like really generate that activity up front has become so kind of it's so paramount to like really getting effective hunting out of the gate when you start that hunt process. So for me right now, that's one of the things I tend to bang my head against the most is like figuring out how to properly emulate these things or get the data points where I need them. So my hypothesis is proven, right? So it's at that phase now.
Yeah.
Early on, the struggles, like if this matters for people starting, like just getting out of the gate early on, a lot of it was just really understanding the data and my environment. My environment that I was in tend to throw me so many curveballs to where every second I thought I got it, somebody be like, well, this network's configured in a different way. So that weirdness you see or this goofy IP, that's just kind of how it was set up. Where when my hypothesis took me down this road, it was like, this looks awful. This looks terrible. We should probably look at this. It's like, no, that's business as usual. So there were so many like setbacks going through that phase that I can't even count them how many times that happened. But that early onset was like knowing the data in the environment. That I hit so many roadblocks doing that like early on.
So, Paul, before you get started, I'm just going to just piggyback off his because I completely agree. You think you have a perfect hypothesis, you jump it in and you drop it into this tool, and then, well, from my perspective, and this was great. I will say was it called the correlation engine? Whenever you showed us how you could see how much resources a detection was
Oh
creating.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Yo, in our
so
sims, yeah.
So back when I became a detection engineer, Costura was actually getting his experience as an engineer, so keeping the sim alive. And I was like, I got a great one. I create a detection, drop it in, and you hear a badge beep. I look up, he'd walk through the door, he'd pull me aside, he'd be like, dude, this is breaking. And then finally, he showed me this process of, look at this. This gives you a good percentage of how resource intensive it is, how many logs is going, and so on. And that, I think just that little bit helped move me down that path of, this gives me a metric or something measurable to see how well it's doing compared to what I think it's doing. And then, going through, like Tom said, tuning it there. But I still remember those days of, Lee, is this detection you created? Yeah.
No, that's off topic a touch, but like tying it back in, that is absolutely a struggle, right? Like
Oh,
your
yeah.
environment, like threat hunting as an idea has all these parameters, but your environment is going to restrict what you can use. So you're only going to be able to go after certain things in that environment and have limitations you're going to cross that you're going to discover along the way, right? That's a great point, Leah. Kind of forgot about some of those moments, but as soon as you said the badge thing, I heard the sound in my ear. Like
Yeah,
I
no,
heard
so did
the
I.
sound and the click because there was always a
Yeah.
timing on the click, the handle
Yep,
opening and
yep,
the
yep.
door shutting. Yep.
Uh, yeah, for me, like both you guys are dead on. Like like the big day to day struggle is that hypothesis to validation, because just like you said, there's sometimes where just trying to emulate something to generate data, but then also how do you compare it to what's normal data to validate it's even a good hypothesis? Like that whole thing is always a challenge with, like, I think every new threat hunt. But the other thing I think is a challenge is understanding your tool's capabilities. I don't know how many times, and we're fortunate enough where we work across a lot of different platforms, so we get to see them all, which in some ways makes it harder because you're like, can this tool do this? Can it do that? Whatever. Um, but there's sometimes where you have, you have a good hypothesis, but based on how the data is presenting itself when you hunt, it's just not reliable enough to say I can hunt for something effectively and not just completely drown out. But sometimes there are some capabilities or function calls or way to do things with a tool where you can solve that problem with just knowing, what is the menu of list of things I could try, or thinking about the problem slightly different. The benefit to that problem, though, is usually understanding the tool, unless you completely, uh, redo your security infrastructure or replace tools. That problem slowly starts to dissolve, right? You get more comfortable with your tools. You have more ways to approach the problem. That part's good. But that's something I think, especially if you're dropped into a new environment or a tool set you're not familiar with, there is some value to looking at kind of like the manuals for certain tools. But it's also a great way where you can potentially use Chat GPT to say, what are some unique things on how I can maybe structure data, and get what are some examples. And Chat GPT can look at things out of that to help you answer those questions easily. That I think is also very impactful. And the nice thing there too is you don't have to really worry about, am I sharing sensitive information most of the time, because it's nothing about your environment. It's about a tool that anyone probably can get the manual to anyways. So putting stuff like that into Chat GPT or some sort of language model to help answer some of those questions on functionality capability, I think is a good approach starting out, especially if you want to hit the ground running. But that would be one of the, I think, a big hurdle that we always have to constantly ask each other questions like, how do you do this again? What does regex look like in this tool? If I want to use regex, just whatever it is, those are hurdles all the time.
I think that's the worst, is the different regular expressions.
Oh, I
Now,
know, I know.
I will say one tool. I'm not going to mention it because I feel like a lot of them are good. I don't want to say one's better than the other. One tool has it figured out, and it's really simple to use regular expression, and um, it's just amazing. Now we just need that tool to spread its love everywhere. Hopefully,
It just needs to be consistent. Like if that's the one thing every tool can, be consistent, say, look, we're going to do regex like this, and every tool just supports that way. One, the libraries that support regex should probably get easier because they can just implement a core functional thing in all their products, but it'd make everyone better in the security. Like that's, yeah, but that's obviously a bias.
you won't have to dig for the GitHub repo of, hey, look at this special tools regular expression library we got. Like, use all these, and then you have one GitHub, one resource. But you know, I think I always mention that. Like, I wish the big three in cybersecurity, or like Microsoft, Google. Imagine if they got together and worked as well as ransomware operators do. Like, they share all the stuff that works all the time because money's driven. But on the blue side, I don't know.
Yeah,
They don't.
if we made money based on how well we defended,
That's true.
that would be
Because
great.
we're always overhead.
Right.
We're always overhead. Yeah, I think Poli, you got the next question. This is a good one.
Yeah. So, what are some things you wished you had as a threat hunter? You know, going into it, more wishes.
Oxymoron, the wishing for more wishes. I'll kick it off, I guess. Time, um, specifically
Mm,
time to train. I think as you get into threat hunting, one of the things that naturally like exposes itself in cybersecurity is there's just so much stuff. There's so many different areas to get better at. There's so many different things to learn, and you're trying to catch up with that in an environment that is constantly, rapidly changing, right? So it's not like a cave in here to say time, but I wish that time allowed itself more room to specifically train, like to really be able to dive in on some of these things or really be able to focus on some of these ideas I have and learn about certain things so I can stitch together these more advanced hypotheses. I do wish that that was a thing. Like for me, that's always been generally the problem. The other hurdles that I faced previously, like with knowing what to do or having the right leadership to allow me to go after something or kind of like, build the idea on the fly. Like I've overcome those things in my career, but at this stage in the game, time to train and really spend time diving into a thing without having to move to the next thing or react to the new thing that's come out, right? I think we all face that, and I think for me that's the biggest challenge for myself.
so less of a flat circle is what you're looking for.
Yes,
Yeah.
less of a flat circle.
We just need the threat actors to calm down.
Yeah. So,
Yeah.
you know, this one was interesting because, like I've kind of described before, I felt like when I was coming into threat hunting or the idea of threat hunting, um, it was kind of new for everybody, right? Um, and something that we've experienced working together and actually having a team and some people with experience in the field doing threat hunting is a mentor. Man, like having somebody to be able to ask questions or a community to surround yourself with. Like I can't imagine if I filled a threat hunting seat and I was the only person in an organization and people came to me for answers, right? Because as we know, just by trying to build hypothesis and hunt for something, you might not get anything. So then you have almost no support when you're like, yeah, I hunted for this, I didn't find anything. They'd be like, are you even doing your job? But if you have that community of support, like this is what everyone else is looking for, they're looking at it the same way, and some people are finding stuff, some people aren't, or whatever, to validate that at least you're doing the right thing. I think this goes a long way with your own personal confidence, but also making sure like you're validated in what you're doing, and adding some clout to why it is you do what you do and the value to some of that. And um, I think threat hunting is the one space in security. I think it's because of kind of how it sits in some organizations. A lot of people just kind of share the hat with threat hunting. It's not a lot of dedicated threat hunters. So even trying to have that like mentorship or senior pecking order or whatever it looks like from a threat hunting perspective, we just don't. And I think that's why, like this podcast for me exists is to try to help establish some of that. But having people in the community or people who can lean on from that mentor perspective, I think is really big, especially when you're kind of solving problems so different than we've been solving them for the past 10 to 20 years, right? To try to break that mold successfully to do good and great things.
That's a good, but real quickly before you go on that, that's such a great point, Scott. The how many times like if we've come up through our career where we're like, hey, we don't understand this and we wish we had somebody that we could bounce things off or they could give us their experience on.
Mm,
I remember like or very early on that one of the intimidating factors about the cybersecurity field really was this kind of like close to chest, like reserved thing by our peers in general. I do think that's evolved, but I know early on it was like, man, nobody wants to teach me how to do anything. Nobody wants to talk to me about anything. It was like you're really kind of on an island.
yeah.
So man, that's a great point about the mentorship thing, like the idea of being able to share that stuff. I think that's probably why we've natively been so active, like trying to, like so open, like, hey, let's talk about it. Yeah, I want to talk about it.
Yeah,
You want to
right?
know? Hey, I want to tell you. Yeah, here, you don't have to go through the same struggles we did. Learn from us, you know?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Sorry, Lee.
No, no, you're good because I think you hit on it. Now, I was just about to say that that open community, the things we do, the podcast, the trainings, that's all trying to fill. And I'm not trying to stand on a soapbox and toot our own horns and stuff, but we recognized the gap, and I feel like we really want to focus on closing that gap and give the resources to the community that we wish we had, trainings, talks, podcasts, and so on. Um, that mentor, and I'm gonna actually call out two people. I don't know if they're in here today, but James Navarro and Jacob Wellnitz. Early on, they were big supporters of us. I'm sure they still are because I'm sure I'll reach out every once in a while. Um, but James would like he would just reach out randomly and be like, "Hey man, this was a great hum package. Like these are things we're seeing. Um, what when he's working and so on. And it was nice to hear the validation of the work that we're doing, the hypotheses that we're putting together, that we're on point, like or we're close, right? Even if he was, even if the answer was, hey, there was tons of false positives, like, well, okay, good, like let's talk about that and let's see if we can work them out. Um, but it was good to have that community and that conversation in my earlier years. We still talk, but I think it was a lot more. Granted, I think they both took positions that are very, very busy this time, um, as they progressed in their career as well. So they've been moving on and up too, and with more more experience comes more responsibility. But the mentorship is huge, and saying all the reasons Polly said. Direction, I think, uh, all three of these would have been. I can't say one's more than the other, because if I would have started actual threat hunting when I thought I started threat hunting, I probably would be a little more advanced than I am now, simply because that would have saved me like 3 or 4 years. But then again, when I thought I was threat hunting, it was still the early stages of threat hunting. So, the people the people who probably did it early on, who didn't call threat hunting, they just called it their job.
Yeah.
The I guess the giants or the shoulders of the giants that we're standing on now, um, they knew what they were doing. They've been doing this for years, right? We're just kind of emerging with better tools than they had, um, better logs, better everything. Um, but that, yeah, I can't say one's more powerful than the other.
As it's really echoes why the field itself experiences the golden nugget, right? Like that's the thing. Like the experience you've gone through, what you can learn from people that have had that experience are just there's no price tag you can put on that.
Right. I think so. Like the next section that we kind of will cover some stuff like how to level up. I think this will cater hopefully to your question earlier, Ian Cyber, about how do you progress and some things that we do. So yeah, I think Lee, you can kick in this one off.
And so, what are some things you leaned on when challenged in threat hunting? So, what were the early resources or people, tools, other than Bloodhound?
So I have no idea if Scott's gonna say this one because I know this one's near and dear to his heart just from knowing him for so many years. But for me, I'm gonna start with this. A whiteboard was so important, but along with that was being in a place where I had people that I could ask questions to, right? And
Mhm.
and almost typically it was never asking questions to um somebody that knew like a mentor level because we just like early on we just discussed like that really wasn't a thing.
Just
But the
talk it through.
people that were in the room with me, just talking through it, just starting to connect dots on a whiteboard, throwing spaghetti at the wall. I use that term so damn much in my cyber career. That has always been important for me personally when it comes to threat hunting, is being able to have a place to put this idea or just process that thought you might have, even if it's right or wrong, whatever, but be able to frame it and have some kickback on it, have a peer review to that idea. That also goes in the, throwing spaghetti at the wall when you're trying to dig through data too, right? They kind of both play together, but you can leaning on like a people around me that I can talk to, or a community that I can bounce an idea off, or whatever, or get through one part of the hurdle of the challenge like that. That was something that I leaned on heavily early on in my career, especially when it was coming into the whole bucket of threat hunting things. Yeah, I just think that's important to have that whiteboard, have people you can throw stuff against. Even at minimum, get yourself a whiteboard and draw it out. It's wild how you start putting that on the board, and the everything starts clicking a little bit for
You
you. You
think
start
about it
seeing the
differently.
holes in your thoughts. Yeah, you see the holes in your process. You see things you didn't think about before, and you can. So many solutions have been put together on some whiteboards over the years, for sure.
So once again, Pulley, I keep doing this. I apologize, but I'm going to piggyback off that just real quick. I keep cutting Pulley off, but I think what really helped too, and once again, not just because you two are here, you guys created an environment that was, I guess, Planet Fitness style, the judgment-free zone. Whenever I would like throw something out there, the questions weren't what made you think of this, or how stupid can you get. It was like, well, what was your reasoning, what was your understanding of this, what's your evidence, and so on. And then once you got the perspective, then it was like, let's piece this together. It may have been the dumbest idea in the world, but the way you approached it, or the environments that we worked in, the way they approached it was, let's understand what you were thinking first and see how we can make this work if possible. That was huge. And I guess I know that that type of environment isn't always around, and it may not exist in everyone's environment, but that was a huge addition to the problem solving and to
Yeah, the
everything.
culture was I agree.
Agreed.
I think we
Yeah.
did a good job with creating the right kind of culture for like developing ideas.
Yeah. And it still exists here until 471. The people we got asked the same questions of, what do you want to do? I want to do this. Okay, what do you need from us versus no, that's done.
Hmm.
But
Yeah, so for me, like I said before, like the mentor thing is big, but like when I ran into a lot of challenges in threat hunting, especially when trying to make something work or understand something, just people in general. Like, there's sometimes when I'll be looking at a problem, and it doesn't have to be the security person that I have to bounce ideas off of. It could be like, who was the admin on that machine? When I see this weird behavior, can they explain it to me in a way where now I'm like, oh, I know how I can actually alert for weird things? Or maybe just that conversation and alleviates a lot of the noise because they can be like, oh, it doesn't need to do that. I can change something, like stuff like that. So just being open to talk to anybody about your problem and comfortable with that has helped me with many different hurdles. The other thing is sometimes we get so head down in some things that are really, really hard to solve. And we have this huge pressure to show value or return on our work, right? Being able to know when to put a pin in something, like, all right, I don't know what to do with that today. I'm gonna think about that tomorrow. Like being able to step away and come back sometimes is all you need, right? But sometimes you might step away and actually accomplish two or three other things that may have been easier. And now you don't have that same level of pressure to get something done. So now you can think clearer about a problem that maybe you're trying to get around, that may be really impactful if you're able to solve it. And then the last little trick that I find very useful is just a common thing you kind of learned in like grade school, right? Like if you want to understand something, like compare and contrast. Like, I don't know how many times where I'm like, I'm looking at something and I'm like, I don't know really what this means. Oh, let's compare it to this other system that's similar. Do they behave or the same way? Yes or no? What about, does this user behave like this user, but they perform the same job functions? Yes or no? Like just being able to just stack data against each other like that, sometimes has helped me answer really difficult questions. Especially when people are like, well, is this normal? Like, I don't have to understand even what it's doing, but if I can say in my environment it is, that's all I need to say sometimes. You might look online and people are like, oh, this is absolutely weird. This should never happen. And then you're like, what's happening all over? Is this a problem? It's like, no, it just means that's just how things are. And that's why knowing yourself is so important. And almost the most important, because some things just don't work. Like if I build a hunt for me and I'm thinking it's the greatest thing and I can prove it out, you drop it in your environment like, well, this is dog, whatever. Uh, yeah, it might be in your environment because your environment's just different. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad idea. It just means that you have different challenges than I do. And so I think some of those things really help people get past some major hurdles, especially when starting out, being able to do those things.
And for time's sake, I'll make mine short, which is, I know, surprising to everyone. Getting up and walking for 5 to 10 minutes. I don't know how many times I've been slamming my head against the wall
Yeah.
and just stuck, and I can't emulate it, or I'm not getting the right logs, blah, blah, and then just go away for a little bit. Walk the dogs, walk on the treadmill, get, fresh air outside, and sometimes that really just solves all your problems.
Just disconnect for a second. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, now, when you started out, or even maybe even now, mine's more of a list of when I started out, but what are some of your favorite resources that really you always seem to lean on, in general to do threat hunting, get better at threat hunting, think of new threat hunts, whatever that may be? What would you guys think that is?
You can go first
Mm,
out.
For me, it's going to be one. I know we live in a weird world right now, so this is not meant to strike any of those nerves, but um, using resources that are out there that can connect you to communities that are full of people that are actively talking about these things. Um, to me, those resources tend to be some of the most thought-provoking, problem-solving areas. So what I mean by that is um, finding where these communities exist, whether they're somewhere, in a certain forum somewhere, or things that I've leveraged quite heavily over the years to like stay engaged with the community is on social media, like on Twitter. Like there's a lot of researchers, a lot of people out there that are talking about things, talking about net new stuff, out off the wire things. It's always been awesome to stay attached to that community and engage with that community because you're talking through the problems, right? It goes all the way back to that whole, get a whiteboard, so we get against the wall. So, um, short of like giving you all the different types of resources, the URLs, all the tool sets, using the different things that are out there, your virus totals of the world, all the different OSINT avenues, things like that. Those are absolutely crucial. But for me, being able to stay attached to the community has been my favorite thing when I reference what a resource is. So a lot of times I've talked through problems and I've referenced something that's come out of a specific cyber researcher or some new idea that somebody put out on one of the accounts that are out there, and being able to reference that as the starting point for a new hypothesis or working through a problem. I love that area because it excites me about the field more too, because I see more people thinking about this than myself, so I'm not isolated, right? So that's always been a resource for me, and I encourage people to find them communities and attach themselves to it, especially people coming out of the gate. Like even if you're just watching and learning, these are people that are live on the ground doing stuff and actively talking about it. It's a gold mine of information.
I listened to Miter Sack. It just has so much information. I have there has not been a time where I'm checking a hypothesis that I created to see if it's there and gives me more information simply because they gather the data that actually happened. App Anyrun, I love it. It's a nice little place to see like dynamic analysis, so you can see what other things are happening. So if there is something that was missing on Mother Attack or a new thing that hasn't made it there yet, you can always check there. LinkedIn to kind of parrot what Tom was talking about with the community. That's huge. Like knowing people, and you don't even have to know them. I don't know how many connections I have that are connected just because they were like, hey, I like the workshop. Hey, I like what Cyborg's doing. Hey, just to talk, like see what they are doing, see what their perspective is. And then threadable feed, it's just like a little resource I found. It's just a feed of different articles and stuff. I always like to check that, um, see what's latest and greatest.
Yeah. So, mine, I'm sure everyone will recognize most of what I put up there, right? When I started out, these are like my go-to, in general. just to kind of try to understand attacks, understand data. But like MITRE ATT&CK, obviously there's great links off of there if you're doing research on attacks to find other reports to dig into to understand what's going on there. The Lolbin project, they have great examples of actual command lines and things that have been used with some of those tools, as well as some resources to kind of wrap your head around what does the lay of the land really look like. DFIR reports is just a great intro to uh, what kind of information and data is available for you to threat hunt on, as well as it tied to specific attacks. So I think that's really good. Hack tricks is something I really leaned into for emulation and attack approaches, and maybe some ways and different types of attacks that maybe not that are like spelled out, right? So you can emulate those better for validation, but also kind of build some hypothesis and maybe how to defend against those. And then the ultimate window security, like I don't know how long I've been using that because one, I don't really remember all the event IDs, but a lot of times when I'm trying to solve a really weird problem in Windows, I usually can almost turn there and find, oh, there's an event for this, and then understanding it, do we even have that data? What does it take to even like log that and go through that whole conversation? But obviously, understanding data is a really important part of our job. And since we use Windows environments, that kind of became a big thing. I could probably throw Sysmon up there as well as a great source, but it doesn't really provide information more than just the events themselves. But yeah, those are kind of where I had started in my process of threat hunting as far as just some core things that when I had nothing better to do, I can dig into those and probably find something.
Can't believe I forgot about Ultimate Windows Security.
I figured yours was going to be in there too. Like that was the one person. I know Tom doesn't care, but I knew you did. So.
That is, in my mind, I didn't even think about that. Like, what are some references? But yeah, my God, do we use that one often? Like,
Yeah.
that one's been like one of the main ones I've used forever.
That goes back to when I
Love that
started,
site.
right? Yeah. But yeah, so based on time, we'll probably kind of end that here, but I want to make some mentions, right? So Lee's going to be running a threat hunting foundations workshop, moving beyond IOCs to behaviors and TTPs. It's actually like a good full course kind of session. It's abbreviated some of the trainings he's done in the past. But if you want to give like a 30-second kickoff of what that looks like, Lee, go ahead.
Yeah. So first off, I'll warn you, it's 4 hours long. There will be a 10-minute break in between, but basically we designed this to go from the very beginning. Prior, like if you think about our workshops that we do, we already grab a hunt package that's created. We go to the very beginning, resources, models that exist that we can use to help with threat hunting. We talk about, and we actually pull an intel report. We extract artifacts. We create our own hypotheses. And then, like our other workshops, we give you an OVA that has the logs on it already. We take our hypotheses, create a query, and then dive into the data and take a look at it. And then, we expand on the hunt packages in the Hunter platform, because the whole idea is we want to teach you from the very beginning to the end, so that if there is, if there's a situation where you need to, you can go through it all and just kind of trying to elevate everyone in the community that we can.
So yeah, with that, I really want to thank everyone for joining. Once again, love talking shop with friends and colleagues. Please, if you like what you hear, check us out on the Apple Podcast, Spotify, or just about really anywhere else you consume podcasts. Leave a good review to help others discover us. Join the conversation. And for those that don't know, we also do a brief 30 to 45 minutes episode that hits on top news topics, intelligence reports, technical write-ups for the week. Usually will air on Wednesdays when we're able to kick it off. But keep a lookout for that as well and subscribe. Once again, I appreciate everybody's time.
Happy hunting, everybody.